Chapter 5. The tunnel opened to tall pines and dense undergrowth. Sun fell and bounced off lush green leaves. Some leaves and bushes rustled as a slow breeze whooshed past the woods. It was beautiful in a haunting way. "Where is the rail?" the priest asked. Jerry pointed forward, some yards away from where the rail was not completely covered. It led them further into the woods. It didn't look very dense. In the distance, there was a light fog blocking most of what was on the other side. They all stood silent for a moment. "Is this how it is supposed to be?" Howard asked, turning to the conductor. Norman shook his head. He hadn't seen anything like this before. "I don't think so. They wouldn't let the rails get overtaken by a forest, and this." He gestured to the trees and grasses. "They don't look like they just growth recently." Howard sighed. He turned to Jerry and then to Colm. Both men shrugged as if they could see what each thought, and they agreed. "The rail is probably buried further in the forest. It would be stupid to follow it," Henry said. Howard eyed the man, but before he could speak, Colm cut in. "I think that is what we should aim to reach." He was pointing at a mountain that was barely visible from where they stood. But the bridge there was unmistakable. Howard grunted. "I guess it is settled. Those who think they would like to wait to be rescued should go back to the train and wait. I won't sit around and put my life in the hands of some people I haven't seen or heard of before. We will go to that bridge. We might find a way out of the damn place from there." "That is stupid," Henry said. His voice was a little too high than he wanted because he looked as surprised as everyone else. He swallowed and continued. "You don't know what the hell is out there, and you will what? Just waltz into it like some damn leatherhead?" "No one asked you to come," Howard said. His eyes were fierce, and his scar seemed to stretch. "In fact, please don't." Howard turned and left. Colm followed behind him, and then the priest joined them. The conductor took a while to make up his mind, and then he followed Howard too. Jerry turned to Jolene. "What do you think?"
"You will follow them, won't you?"
Jolene asked, and Jerry nodded. She smiled and adjusted grace again. She looked back into the darkness, where the train lay waiting for saviors that probably didn't know they were stranded yet. Farther away. "I have to keep moving." She sighed and nodded.
"I guess we are getting our adventure, after all."
Jerry chuckled and walked in front of her. She turned back to see Henry and Mary leaving. Henry was saying something about how foolish they were to leave safety to take their chances with the wild. The older man looked at them for a moment, waved at Grace, and followed the couple.
"I hope they will be all right,"
Jolene said as she followed Jerry. "Not like we will have it easy either," Jerry said. Jolene nodded. The walk through the forest was easy as long as they followed the path created by the rails. The path was cleared, and since the trees were sparse, sunlight filtered through to give them as much illumination as possible. They walked quietly for some minutes, each person deep in his thoughts. The only sound was the rustle of leaves and the occasional scuttle.
"Why do you have a gun, though?"
Jolene asked Jerry. His shirt was soaked with sweat after about 30 minutes of walking. The gun looked heavy, but he carried it like it was nothing. "Why? Scared?" Jerry teased, and Jolene frowned. Jerry chuckled. "We were in the army, all three of us."
"Oh."
"Yeah. Howard had it rougher than the rest of us, but, shit," Howard said, stopping immediately. Colm crashed into him and cursed too before glaring at Howard. "What is it?" Jerry called when he saw that they had stopped. "The rail is gone," Howard said as he looked at the trees in front of them. Twice as much as they had seen so far, the undergrowth was denser than before. "What do you mean it is gone?" Jerry asked. "Well, I am not seeing it in front of me," Howard said, turning to Jerry as he made his way forward. They had all been walking in a single file, and now they stood as if in a queue. "Did you see where it went, though?" Colm asked, his yellow teeth bared in a smile. Jerry smiled and then cursed when he realized how bad things had become. There would be no path leading them to the mountains without the rail. "How about that?" the priest asked, pointing to the side, behind some trees, where there was a cleared path in the undergrowth. It led through the trees and probably towards the mountains. "That means we will be leaving the rail, that could lead us further away from where we should go," Norman said. Howard nodded and started cutting his way to the path. "The rail is gone, conductor," Colm said as he followed Howard. The others followed too. The new path was not as clear as the tracks had been. It looked like it had not been used for a while, but still, it was better than cutting through the bush blindly. Jolene started to feel the weight of her daughter on her arms. The place where she cut herself throbbed. The pain was dull but heavy, as if her hand was getting heavier by the second. "I was telling you about the guns," Jerry said, slowing down so she could catch up. Jolene smiled and nodded for him to continue. His voice was a good distraction from the pain. "When we got back from the war, there was nothing for us. We had no money, no real life to get back to. I had only a wife who didn't stop loving me. Then
You are married?
Jolene asked. Her eyes were wide in shock, and her voice a bit high. The priest turned for a second before walking on. Jolene looked down, a bit shocked by how she reacted. "I was," Jerry said. When what he meant clicked, Jolene nodded, her eyes growing softer and her face burning.
"Sorry."
Jerry waved her sympathy with a smile. Jolene started walking beside him again, and he continued. "Well, I became a jerk, a real douche. I went home drunk every night, pissing my wife off and sleeping off while she ranted. I was a real piece of shit."
"Yes, you were,"
Jolene said. There wasn't any sting to her words. She was simply agreeing. Jerry chuckled and shook his head sadly. "I started borrowing. Since there was no other way to get money. I promised to pay it back, but I didn't. Then it got to a point where I could only borrow from some filthy characters. They were the dirtiest of the dreg. They had a dark idea about collecting their debt. Jerry stopped, turned to Jolene, and his eyes were wild with anger. It was brief, but Jolene saw it. "They took the only thing I had, the only person I love."
"They killed her?"
Jerry nodded. "Now, we rob them. We will take from them until they have nothing. Until we have nothing to collect anymore but their lives. Then they will feel the emptiness I felt, and if that is not enough, I will introduce them to a different kind of despair." He said everything with a smile. In that dark place of vengeance, he was beautiful. Jolene's heart raced with questions. She couldn't find a straightforward way to categorize him. He was a thief, but he was something like Robin Hood. He had a dark past, but he looked pure. She shook her head to dispel the thoughts. It didn't matter. His past wasn't her problem. What he is and the plans he had for those people weren't in her schedule for herself and her daughter. Jerry was some steps ahead when she looked up. The pain in her hand was getting worse. It throbbed badly. Even though the bleeding had stopped, there was still the pain to think about. "Are you all right?" Jerry asked, looking back at her. Jolene nodded. They had been walking for a long time, and she was getting very close to her limit. She looked at Grace, who was still sleeping inside. It was better than she was asleep, but she would have to walk on her own soon. Jolene wished she could carry for as long as they had to walk in the woods.
"How much longer do we have to go?"
Jolene asked. She knew she sounded like a kid, but she couldn't help it. The other marched on silently, even the priest. "A bit more, I think. Those mountains are not looking very far anymore," Jerry said. Jolene nodded. She had to make a decision quickly. She wouldn't last long if she kept carrying the Grace. That was for sure. She shook Grace slightly as she walked. The child blinked. Her eyes took a while to reorient themselves, and then she looked at her mother.
Baby, you will have to walk yourself,
Jolene said. Grace's eyes fought off the sleeping weighing on them. She grumbled a bit and yawned.
But I am tired,
Grace said, her face folding into a frown. Jolene sighed. I can take the next shift, Jerry said. Jolene looked from his face to the gun.
Carry her with that gun?
He grinned and stretched his hands to her. Grace turned and went to him. Jerry cradled her against his shoulder with one hand and held the gun with the other.
Thank you,
Jolene said. She flexed her hand as they made up to catch up with the others. Grace closed her eyes almost immediately. The new path winded around endlessly. The mountains seemed to get closer, but they never got to it. Jolene soon realized that the trees were getting bigger and close-knitted. They were getting less light because the trees were interlocking above them, and there was something else.
Mist?
Jolene whispered. Jerry grunted and nodded. Jolene wondered how much longer they would get light to see where they were going and how farther they would go.
The mist is rising.
Jerry nodded again. The mist had gone up, but it could just be that they were walking deeper into it. Grace stared at her mother and smiled. Jolene shook her head, but she couldn't blame her. Then she caught Grace's frown.
What is it, honey?
Jolene asked.
Something is following us, Mom,
Grace said. Jolene turned around immediately. There was nothing there. She turned around to Grace, but her daughter was not just frightened this time. She was terrified and pointing frantically.